Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and a number of other online venues. Today we're going to go into something I call the 10 Lamps. The 10 Lamps are a fictional core philosophy. They exist in my Assembling Terrania stories, which are works of speculative fiction that imagine our long adventure as a species toward greater maturity and consciousness. So in this series, at one point, there is a philosopher named Simeon. He lives in pretty tough times, maybe 40, 50 years in advance of us. And it's at a time when climate chaos has accelerated so much that it's difficult for anyone to stay outside for very long because of the heat. So we've all had to do things to adapt. There's a lot of hardship and poverty. And in the midst of all that, he decides to be the vehicle for a philosophy of hope. He's not one of those famous, wealthy, and successful philosophers that come along every now and then. He's a bit itinerant. He is focused on the message rather than on acquiring honors or property. And the simple philosophy that he leaves behind becomes the core for efforts down the road to build a worldwide community out of justice, abundance, an earth-honoring community, a cosmos-honoring community, which will eventually go by the name Terrania. So why would something like this even matter, this kind of fictional philosophizing? Well, I do it for one because it's entertaining. I like doing it. For another, fictional philosophies have had an impact on me. So I'm thinking of the example, for instance, of the Vulcan philosophy of infinite diversity and infinite combinations. It's fictional. The writers of Star Trek came up with it, and it was a cornerstone of the philosopher Surak's efforts to unify Vulcan in peace thousands of years ago. That's in the fictional universe, but there are plenty of people, me included, who find the Idic philosophy inspiring, even though we know perfectly well it's fictional. Ursula K. Le Guin's novels have a lot of ecological and feminist philosophy built into them. When I was growing up, I read Gordon R. Dixon's Dorsey books, which at their heart are about humanity's attempts to achieve what he calls the full spectrum responsible human, which we do through initiation and hardship until we finally achieve a kind of cultural wholeness. And there's lots of other examples. In a sense, the philosophies of human maturity that we find in some of the religions could also be considered fictional. Not fictional in the sense of something that's arbitrarily made up and untrue, but fictional in the sense of drawing on imaginal sources, deep imaginal sources, that are also linked in with the presence of nature, the presence of spirit. Those kinds of resources come not just from the personal unconscious, to use Jungian language, but the collective unconscious, or what in my Assembling Terrania books is referred to as the realm of the dream veil. I think, too, there are wider implications than just the inspiration of individuals. Sonequa Martin Green is the actor who plays Captain Michael Burnham on the show Star Trek Discovery, and in an interview with CBS News, she pointed out that when you can imagine more utopic possibilities than the ones we now live in, that's a first step in actually moving toward them. In other words, we can't get there if we can't imagine what we want and how to do it. There is a tale in my Assembling Terrania cycle called 10 Lamps. It's written in the first person, and it's actually the lamps themselves, the philosophy itself, as the psychical being, an imaginal being, who tells the story of how it came into existence and a little bit about what it means and the times that it occurred in. So let's go through the 10 lamps and see what we can make of them. I always imagine them as arranged in a sort of tree. A tetractris, as Pythagoras would put it. So there's one on top and then two underneath and then three and so on. And the idea here is that the lamp below or following derives light from the previous. So 2 and 3 get their light from 1 and so on. And then they pass it on down. The first 5 lamps are what I think of as lamps of being and story, and the next 5 are lamps of togetherness and futurity. And for me, the benefits of treating this as a path of inspiration include a sense of purpose, a cause to struggle for, a worldview that I find spacious to live in, an ethical compass, permission to enjoy the beauty of existence, goals to work toward, a governance ideal, a path of healing, re-enchantment in human possibilities, and hope. Noetic hope, hope through the power of consciousness. So, not bad for a fictional construct. Number 1 is called the lamp of creative diversity. The nature of our cosmos is ever-unfolding creative diversity, with affiliations arising from a variety of voices, entities, and presences. When I first started to study Whitehead's philosophy, I really liked his emphasis on creativity. And it shows up in other philosophies too, but it's evident in how the world makes things. There's an exercise I do with my students in which I combine Jungian archetypal theory with my permaculture background. And I ask them to go out into the world and look for basic patterns. Curving patterns, circles, branches, honeycombs, things like that. And then come back and we'll talk about it. And when my students have done this, they'll find maybe 50 at most. Around that number, a few more, a few less. And one of the things that we all come away with is a sense of awe that nature can create everything it is and continue to create with relatively few simple patterns. It's amazing. So that's the first lamp of the 10 lamps, the lamp of creative diversity. Creativity through variety, difference. And part of our task in life, if we want to be fully mature, is to learn to appreciate those differences, all of which have the common ground of the universe itself. Number 2 is the lamp of animate being. Everything in the cosmos at every level is alive and communicative in its own way. So this is reflected, of course, in pretty much every indigenous philosophy. It's reflected in ancient Chinese philosophy. There's a whole animistic tradition in the West. And Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, talks about the expressiveness of things. He doesn't necessarily assume that they're ensouled, but everything, even the things we consider inanimate and lifeless, are a kind of gesture. And we interact with them through our perceptions. This is something, too, that's also studied by terrapsychology, which looks at how the things of the world are alive inside of us, and how our reactions often accurately record in symbolic form the events that are going on around us, whether that's the natural world or the built environment. So everything animate, we live in a universe of presences rather than mere objects. That's lamp number 2. And you can see how its glow partakes of the first lamp of universal creativity. Lamp number 3 The lamp of universal sympathies. We are inwardly linked to the intelligence of the earth, the cosmos, its archetypal powers, the presence of place, and one another in relations of interdependent reciprocity. In ancient Egyptian religion, this was referred to as Heka, which is usually spelled Heka, and there was even a goddess by that name. And Heka refers to what was later called sympathies by the Stoics and correspondences by Swedenborg, and it has 100 other names all around the world. And it reflects the alchemical saying, as above, so below. It reflects what Carl Jung calls synchronicities, and it means that the things that happen outside of us parallel what goes on inside of us also. Now, the archetypal powers mentioned in this lamp, I got a cue here from Brian Swim's work. He talks about the 10 primal powers of the universe. So, for instance, cataclysm, we might think of as being imaged in myth as the war gods. Or allurement is what we might think of as Oshun and Aphrodite and some of the Eros and love goddesses, Lakshmi. So that's the lamp of universal sympathies. Everything is interconnected and in important ways. Number 4, the lamp of imaginal gnosis. The imaginal realm has its own reality and inspires not by absolute belief, but by belief in. Not by the real, but by the ideal. There is a long cross-cultural tradition of imagination as a wisdom path. Hermeticism is an example. There were elements of it in Egyptian religion, in Gnosticism, in alchemy, in Islamic Gnosticism, the great Persian philosophers of light, starting with Suhawardi. The imagination for them is not just making stuff up. It's a portal to the deeper dimensions of existence, which is why Henri Corbin calls it the imaginal, not just imagination. Jung showed us through his Red and Black Book adventures and his confrontation with the unconscious that when you talk to imaginal characters, they talk back. And oftentimes they say things that you wouldn't have expected. They and the unconscious have their own perceptions, values. It's a little eerie to think that we're not necessarily in charge of our own internal household, but when we see the conscious self as more of a mediator than a master, then things begin to loosen up on the inside with no loss of reality. This lamp also emphasizes belief in rather than belief. I tend to think that belief is overrated, and when you believe in absolute things, my prophet is better than your prophet, then that's where the fighting begins, and it never ends until we give up this literalist belief structure and then decide to be inspired instead. People don't fight over inspirations, but they do fight over which God is true. So the lamp of imaginal gnosis. Number 5, the lamp of guiding stories, which follows naturally from 4, the emphasis on the imaginal. When our guiding stories come from fear and constriction, we block our humanity and cause harm. When they are humane and expansive, they allow us to appreciate each other and the beauty of Earth and cosmos. So in the practice of lorology, which has to do with looking at the stories that guide us and the lore that they're based in, the fictions that we take for authoritative, in other words, we look a lot at keystone stories. Those are the ones that guide us. So my story about who I am, my place in the world, my tribe, my country, what the earth is all about, how we got here, all those stories. It's been said that even a blade of grass has a philosophy. And likewise, I think Everything has its own story if you listen carefully enough. Humans can tell them in ways that we can understand verbally, and in writing and through performance and theater and art. So when we look at our guiding stories, we need to ask ourselves, are they based in fear and punishment and violence, or are they rooted in something higher, in our common humanity, in the things we aspire to together? Change the story and you change the actions that the stories make possible. That's the lamp of guiding stories. So those are the first 5 lamps, the lamps of being and story. The next 5 are the lamps of togetherness and futurity. Lamp 6, the lamp of collective maturation. Humanity is a social species on a long adventure toward full humanness and maturity, which blossom through a sense of ourselves as a part of the greater whole and responsible for the consequences of what we do. So, a social species on a long adventure. In my Assembling Terrania books, that's what is referred to as the long adventure. And the outcome is Terrania, this good society, the society that helps us be fully human. Notice that I'm emphasizing maturity rather than evolution. Evolution is a contested term, and for some people it implies a kind of linear progress. I don't think maturation works that way. It's not linear. Sometimes we mature a bit more, and then we regress, and then we struggle, and so on. So we paint in a little bit more and more of our maturity, I hope, as we go on through life, personally and collectively. But one of the things that helps us do this is the sense of responsibility. I am responsible for the consequences of my actions toward other people, toward Earth, toward the communities I live in. And it's really quite striking, the lack of responsibility, especially in the people we think of as our leaders. There's exceptions, but the leaders who tend to get the most press are the least responsible and the least mature. So the lamp of collective maturation. 7 is the lamp of cosmic alignment. Humanity must learn to relate as appreciative adults to the powers of the cosmos, instead of either ignoring them or subordinating ourselves to them. This is a point that the powers themselves make in my stories. So they are archetypal powers. There's a trickster quality of the universe. There is an expansiveness quality. Mars is there in various forms. All these others that have been worshipped as gods on Earth, all these archetypal powers. And one of the things they're trying to do with the long adventure is to encourage us to relate to them as adults, instead of simply worshiping them or ignoring them, both of which are harmful to us. So that's 7, the lamp of cosmic alignment. 8 is the lamp of fivefold caring. Each of us is of immeasurable worth and worthy of inclusion in our fivefold caring. Care of others, care of self, care of Earth, care of story, and care of possibility. That last being tending the visions that can take us forward. What are the possibilities in what we might do together? So you wouldn't know from current events that each of us is of immeasurable worth because we're not treated that way. But that has often been a cornerstone of religious ethical systems, political ones too occasionally. It's a cornerstone of real democracy. We are each of worth that can't be diminished. And anything that does so try to diminish our worth needs to be discarded and outgrown. 9 is the lamp of flourishing governance. Leadership and social structures that support equity, creativity, liberty, and maturity move us forward. Those that diminish these capacities are regressive and must be outgrown for us to reach true adulthood as a species. I want to underline the word outgrown. So often there's a tendency to make our conflicts about either somebody being a villain or taking more of a therapeutic stance and saying that they're suffering from some kind of pathology. And neither of these seem to help much. We have the structures that we do because we haven't matured enough not to. That's how this lamp tends to view things. And as we mature, we give up the structures that no longer serve. And we create new ones that will move us forward. New ones that perhaps borrow from the old values and principles, but work differently. Many years ago, when my dad was still around, I brought this up to him. We didn't talk politics much because we were such opposites in that regard. But at one point, we were watching the news together, and I can't even remember the story that came on. It just made both of us disgusted. And I said, how is it we think here in the United States that structures that were built in the 1700s to administer a far smaller group of people could possibly be up to the challenge of today? How can we think that that can happen? And he said, well, what do you have in mind? And I said, well, the institutions either need to be redesigned or rebuilt. They don't serve anymore. And we can keep the principles, things like checks and balances, separation of power, democracy, and what have you. But the things that we have going now, they've outworn their usefulness. And he actually agreed, which was kind of a miracle in and of itself, a small miracle. But in any case, we need the structures that make us fully human and support that. And the ones that don't have to go. That's 9, the lamp of flourishing governance. And 10 is the lamp of collective dreaming. Humanity can create a just, equitable, delightful, and earth-appreciating civilization worthy of our labors and struggles, but only if we relearn how to dream together. That's key. How to imagine together, how to appreciate each other's imaginings, no matter how different from ours, and eventually find enough awe and motivation and inspiration from what we imagine to build it. That's the thing. I sometimes hear people say, well, storytelling and imagining isn't enough, which is true, but that's where you start. And once you have a really compelling vision of how to move forward, the means will be found to get there. You have to have the vision first. Because how else are people going to get motivated? Today, in this bitterly divided country where we're basically waging a low-grade civil war without calling it that, where political violence is escalating to the point where even the FBI is alarmed. The discourse is so polarized, and there's really no visions available for how to do better as a country, let alone as a world. So occasionally I hear an inspiring comment from here or from there. But there's no visions of where we want to get. Nobody's really going out there and saying, this is how we can be with each other in a way that makes us safe, that makes sure that we have enough resources and education and everything that we need. So I don't know about you, but I've never been asked by a politician what delights me. I haven't seen any groups of people pull together to dream together, to imagine how things could be better, even at the level of a city, let alone anything else. I'm sure it's been done here and there in a rather local fashion, but why aren't we doing it as a species? Drawing on our greatest resources, including our imagination. There is an agency in the Assembling Terrania stories called the Dream Veil Exchange. And part of it is to bring human beings together to do exactly this, to imagine and give some kind of form to their imaginings, performance, art, graphics, whatever it is, theater, writing. And, that's been done many times. There's many examples around the world even today of enclaves of creativity. And even a few, like the Wakanda Labs folks are doing of imagining better futures. But the Dream Veil Exchange has something a little extra. It calls in the fictional characters of every place, nation, time, and involves them in the conversation with the idea that they have something to say about all this too. We usually think of fictional characters just as our own inventions. But in my stories, they tend not to see it that way. They tend to see it more Jung's way and the way of authors like Ursula K. Le Guin and J.R.R. Tolkien, who stand up on the side of the characters being real. Roger Zelazny, I can think of many others. That they have an imaginal reality, that they reflect something in the human psyche that needs to be heard. And so that the Dream Veil Exchange operates to help us talk to the other side, whether we call it the personal or collective unconscious or the dream veil, so that we have a more balanced sense of what we're all about. It's not so much a think tank as an imagining tank. And in finance, in religion, education, politics, contemporary events, how much imagination do you see behind decisions, really? Do we not live in a time where there is failure after failure, malfeasance after malfeasance, because very simple things to imagine in advance were not imagined? And then everybody acts surprised that they happened. Climate chaos is itself an example of that. There were people in the early 1900s who said, it can't be good for the atmosphere to keep burning up all these fossil fuels. And then the data rolled in, and yet here we are. So now we have to imagine how we get out of it. And we all are going to have to be a little bit like the Chinese goddess Nuwa, who came to Earth one day and saw that the entire sky had turned black. A sacred mountain had been hammered down, and the whole sky fell down with it. There was war and confusion on Earth. And she mixed together the 5 sacred elements alchemically, patched the holes in the sky, and propped it back up again with the giant leg of a sacred tortoise. I sometimes ask my students, how do we access the wisdom of Nuwa today? What are these old stories trying to tell us? We should remember, too, that Nuwa's mate was the emperor magician Fu Xi. We could use a little bit of that wizardry, a little bit of that enchantment these days. So anyway, the 10 lamps appear in that story in Tales of Terrania Rising, which is a free book in PDF form. It's available at my website, chalquist.com. I'm always revising it. At this point, the revisions are rather minor. I'm catching typos and things like that, but I think the basic stories are going to stay about the same. And I've also started making sketches of these archetypal powers I mentioned, who watch us as we struggle for our maturation. And the thing about these powers, sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're obstacles. And it's up to us to determine which way they show up for us. But anyway, I'm going to be eventually putting online my sketches of them too, in the hope that it inspires other people to take these images in a completely different direction. So your version of Clooney the Trickster might be very different from mine, and I hope it is, actually. So we get lots of images going about what these powers look like. And the same with the key characters in the stories. Some of the characters like Enhedwana of Akkad and Shakespeare are, of course, historical figures, but some of the key characters are imaginal. In all of this, I hope there is a bit of inspiration for you. Thanks very much.